Reality is not a collection of fragments. It is a movement. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel did not construct a philosophy to decorate thought. He built a system to expose the inner structure of existence itself. Before modern debates about freedom, before political theory fragmented into ideologies, before intellectual culture in 2025 reduced truth to opinion, Hegel had already declared something radical. Truth lives only in the whole. When the world still separated subject from object, individual from state, faith from reason, he revealed their hidden unity. He saw contradiction not as failure, but as the engine of becoming. This is not abstract speculation. It is a demand placed upon consciousness. Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. Yet clarity requires confrontation. Hegel forces us to ask, what if conflict is not an obstacle, but the very path of truth? What if freedom is not the absence of limits, but participation in a rational whole? He strips away the illusion that independence means isolation. He reveals that consciousness matures only by negating itself, by passing through tension, by enduring contradiction. To understand Hegel is to accept that reality thinks, that history moves with purpose, that spirit becomes what it already is through struggle. From here, we begin the ascent and descent at once, into dialectic, into recognition, into the unfolding totality, where truth ceases to be opinion and becomes living movement. Contradiction is not a flaw in reality. It is the engine of its becoming. What we call conflict is not the breakdown of truth, but its movement. We fear inconsistency because we crave stability. Yet stability is the most seductive illusion consciousness has ever invented. Truth does not sit still. It unfolds. It negates itself. It overcomes itself. And in that violence, it reveals its necessity. Long before modern thought fragmented knowledge into isolated disciplines, before psychology split from metaphysics and politics from ethics, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel saw something ruthless beneath the surface of reason. When the world still believed that logic meant fixed principles and eternal categories, he exposed thought as motion. When philosophy still sought foundations immune to doubt, he revealed that foundation itself trembles and transforms. He did not offer comfort. He offered a system in which contradiction is law. The dialectic is not a technique. It is not a debate strategy. It is the inner pulse of reality thinking itself. Everything that exists contains its own tension. Every identity carries within it its negation. Being does not collapse because of this tension. It advances through it. First, contradiction does not destroy a thing. It drives it forward. We assume that if something contradicts itself, it fails. Hegel demands the opposite. A concept that contains no contradiction is empty. It is dead. Life begins where stability cracks. Consider any conviction you hold. The moment it encounters its opposite, you feel resistance. That resistance is not an accident. It is revelation. It forces the concept to deepen, to refine, to confront its limits. The contradiction exposes what the concept lacked. It strips away illusion. It demands growth. The common misunderstanding is to treat contradiction as logical error. Hegel treats it as ontological necessity. Without it, there is no development, no history, no freedom. There is only static repetition. And static repetition is the true absurdity. Second, negation is not mere destruction. It preserves what it overcomes. This is the movement often mistranslated as cancellation. In truth, it is transformation. When a stage of thought is negated, it does not vanish into nothing. It is lifted, reconfigured, integrated into a richer whole. The child does not disappear when the adult emerges. The earlier form remains, but no longer as dominant. It is retained within a wider structure of meaning. We often believe that growth requires abandoning the past. Hegel insists that authentic growth requires carrying the past within oneself. Negation without preservation is annihilation. Negation with preservation is development. This is why truth cannot be reduced to isolated moments. Each moment contains the memory of its own overcoming. Each stage is both surpassed and sustained. And so truth thickens. It becomes layered. It becomes historical. Third, thought is not manipulated from outside. It moves by its own logic. We imagine that ideas are tools we control. Hegel reverses this arrogance. Concepts possess internal necessity. Once a concept is fully thought, it reveals its insufficiency. It generates its opposite. This is not psychological accident. It is structural inevitability. Pure being, when examined, is indistinguishable from nothing. In that confrontation, becoming arises. The mind does not arbitrarily invent this progression. It discovers it. Logic is not imposed upon reality. Logic is reality articulating itself. The misunderstanding here is to treat dialectic as subjective construction. It is not opinion battling opinion. It is the unfolding of what must follow from what is. Thought moves because it cannot remain confined within partiality, and every partial truth carries within it the seed of its transcendence. Finally, truth exists only in the whole. Isolated facts seduce us. They feel precise. They feel controllable. Yet a fragment detached from its context becomes distortion. Hegel's demand is severe. You cannot grasp truth by clinging to a single perspective. Every perspective is finite. Every position is one-sided. Only when contradictions are integrated into a dynamic totality does truth appear, not as static completeness, but as living system. The whole is not a collection of parts. It is the process through which parts relate, negate, and reconcile. Truth is not a snapshot. It is a movement. To freeze it is to falsify it. What does this mean for the modern individual, standing amid the noise of information and the fragmentation of identity. We live in an age that worships opinion. We defend positions as if they were extensions of our ego. We cancel our position instead of engaging it. We mistake comfort for coherence. Yet the dialectic exposes our fear. We avoid contradiction because it threatens our sense of self. We cling to one side of reality because we fear dissolution. But to refuse contradiction is to refuse development. Modernity has not abolished tension, it has multiplied it. Technology amplifies disagreement, institutions fracture, identities collide. The instinct is to escape into echo chambers. Hegel would call this regression. Conflict is not the enemy, stagnation is. Look inward. Where do you resist contradiction within yourself? You want freedom, yet you crave security. You desire recognition, yet you fear exposure. You demand authenticity, yet you adapt to expectation. These are not flaws to be eliminated. They are the structure of your becoming. The self is not unified simplicity. It is divided striving. You are not a finished entity. You are a tension seeking reconciliation. Every time you attempt to silence one side of yourself, you create repression, and repression returns as anxiety. The dialectic within the psyche is merciless. Denied contradiction does not disappear. It intensifies. Only by confronting opposing impulses can a deeper unity emerge. Not harmony without conflict, but unity forged through it. This is why the dialectic is existential before it is abstract. It confronts you with responsibility. If contradiction is inherent, then growth is unavoidable. The only question is whether you participate consciously. Will you allow tension to refine you, or will you freeze into dogma? Will you integrate your negations, or will you fracture under them? Hegel does not promise peace. He promises necessity. Development is not optional. It is the law of spirit. Consider a symbolic figure such as Hamlet. He hesitates, divided between action and reflection. Many interpret his paralysis as weakness. Through a dialectical lens, it reveals the collision of ethical worlds. His delay is not mere indecision. It is consciousness wrestling with incompatible demands. Action without reflection would reduce him to impulse. Reflection without action would dissolve him into abstraction. His tragedy exposes the cost of unresolved contradiction. Through him we see that selfhood matures only when tension is endured rather than escaped. The character becomes a mirror, not of theatrical drama, but of the inner structure of spirit confronting itself. The dialectic also strips away the illusion of isolated individuality. Every self emerges within relations. Every identity is shaped by what it negates. You define yourself against what you are not. Yet that negation binds you to it. The enemy you reject shapes your form. The tradition you critique remains within your language. Independence without relation is fantasy. The self becomes concrete only through interaction, through resistance, through recognition. Even solitude carries the imprint of society. Thus, contradiction extends beyond the mind into history. Entire cultures develop through clashes of values, institutions, and ideals. What appears as chaos is often structured transformation. Many fear that such a vision eliminates certainty. They long for fixed answers immune to revision. But fixed answers are brittle. they shatter under pressure. Dialectical truth is resilient because it incorporates opposition. It does not deny negativity, it metabolizes it. This is why the whole is powerful. It does not silence dissent, it integrates it into higher articulation. The refusal to evolve is the true collapse of reason. In an era approaching 2025, humanity faces accelerating contradictions. Freedom expands digitally, while attention contracts psychologically. Connectivity increases, while loneliness deepens. Moral language proliferates while ethical clarity erodes. These are not random failures. They are tensions demanding transformation. We can either interpret them as signs of decay or as evidence that consciousness has reached a new threshold. The dialectic forces a decision. Will we cling to partial truths, or will we endure the discomfort required to grasp a larger unity? Hegel's method is ruthless because it refuses sentimental attachment to any single stage. Every position, no matter how cherished, must face its negation. Every structure, no matter how sacred, must reveal its limits. This is not nihilism. It is fidelity to development. The dialectic does not aim to destroy meaning. It aims to deepen it. By passing through contradiction, meaning becomes self-aware. And here lies the demand placed upon consciousness itself. If truth is movement, then awareness cannot remain naive. It must recognize its own role in shaping and being shaped by what it knows. The knower is not separate from the known. The subject is implicated in the object. The very act of thinking participates in the unfolding of reality. Once this becomes clear, certainty takes on a new form. It is no longer rigid conviction. It is trust in the process of self-correction through contradiction. Yet this insight opens another abyss. If consciousness is woven into the fabric of truth's movement, then it must examine itself. It must trace its own stages, its own illusions, its own necessary errors. The dialectic does not end with logic. It turns inward. It asks how awareness itself evolves, how it passes from immediacy to reflection, from certainty to doubt, from isolation to recognition. The method that revealed the motion of concepts now demands that we follow that motion within the structure of experience itself, where consciousness begins its long and perilous journey toward knowing what it truly is. Consciousness does not begin in truth. It begins in illusion. It believes it grasps reality immediately. It trusts what appears. It clings to the certainty of the now. Yet this certainty is the most fragile form of knowledge. What seems direct is already mediated. What feels absolute dissolves under examination. The journey of consciousness is not a peaceful ascent. It is a forced awakening. After the movement of dialectic reveals that truth lives only in the whole, the question sharpens. How does consciousness itself travel toward that whole? How does awareness move from naive immediacy to self-recognition? Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel does not describe a psychological development in the modern clinical sense. He exposes the logical stages through which consciousness must pass. When the world still believed that knowledge simply mirrored objects, he uncovered the hidden labor within perception itself. He stripped awareness of its innocence. The first stage is sense certainty. It claims to know reality through pure immediacy. It says, this, here, now. It insists that the particular object before me is undeniable truth. Nothing seems more solid than direct sensation. You see the tree. You feel the cold air. You taste the bitterness. What could be more certain? Yet this certainty collapses the moment it tries to speak. The word now is uttered, and the moment has already passed. The word here is spoken, and it applies everywhere. What was supposed to be pure particularity turns into universality. The attempt to grasp the singular dissolves into abstraction. Sense certainty believed it possessed the richest knowledge. In truth, it possessed the poorest. It could only point. It could not articulate. The object it thought it held slips into indeterminacy. The misunderstanding is to treat sensation as ultimate foundation. Hegel reveals that sensation is already structured by language and universality. The so-called immediate is mediated by concepts we do not notice. Consciousness learns a brutal lesson. What felt most concrete is actually empty. The stage negates itself. It must move forward. Perception emerges. Now consciousness no longer clings to isolated this. It recognizes stable properties. The object is not just here and now. It has qualities. It is white, solid, extended. Perception organizes multiplicity into unity. It believes it has overcome the poverty of immediacy. It thinks it now grasps the thing as a coherent entity. But contradiction returns. The object is one, yet it has many properties. Is it unity or multiplicity? If the properties conflict, where does the fault lie? In the object or in the perceiver? Consciousness oscillates. It tries to preserve the object as stable substance, yet it cannot avoid the play of diverse attributes. The unity fractures under its own analysis. Here consciousness confronts a deeper instability. It discovers that the coherence it attributes to the object depends on its own organizing activity. The thing is not simply given, it is structured by perception. Again, the stage negates itself. The attempt to secure truth in the object fails because the perceiver cannot be excluded. The division between subject and object begins to tremble. Understanding arises. Now consciousness seeks hidden forces behind appearances. It moves beyond observable properties and posits underlying laws. It says, what you see is not the whole. There is essence beneath phenomenon. The world becomes a network of invisible structures. Science is born from this impulse. Explanation replaces mere description. This stage appears triumphant. It penetrates beyond surface. It discovers regularities. It unifies diversity under principles. Yet, even here, tension persists. The laws posited by understanding are abstractions. They are not visible. They are conceptual constructions that claim necessity. Consciousness begins to suspect that what it calls objective law reflects its own rational framework. The deeper insight emerges slowly. The distinction between knower and known cannot remain rigid. The laws of the world mirror the structure of thought. The more consciousness analyzes reality, the more it encounters itself. What began as an attempt to dominate the object becomes a confrontation with subjectivity. This is the turning point. Self-consciousness appears. Self-consciousness is not simple awareness of oneself as an object. It is the recognition that the truth of knowledge involves the knower. Consciousness no longer looks outward alone. It turns inward. It asks, who is the one that knows? What is this I that claims certainty? This moment is violent. The ego desires autonomy. It wants to assert itself as independent center. Yet it realizes that its identity depends on relation. To be self-conscious is to desire recognition. I know myself only insofar as I am acknowledged. The isolated self is empty abstraction. Identity requires encounter. Before exploring that encounter, the internal structure of self-consciousness must be confronted. Desire defines it. Unlike mere consciousness, which contemplates objects, self-consciousness seeks to negate them. It consumes, transforms, appropriates. It tries to prove its independence by dissolving what stands before it. Yet satisfaction never lasts. The object returns. Desire renews. The self cannot stabilize itself through consumption. This reveals a harsh truth about human psychology. We chase validation, achievement, possession. Each conquest promises completion. Each fades into insufficiency. The self seeks itself in objects and fails. Why? Because objects cannot recognize. They cannot respond. They cannot mirror freedom. Here, the existential dimension sharpens. Modern individuals, even in the era approaching 2025, drown in stimuli. They accumulate experiences. They curate identities. They display images of themselves to invisible audiences. Yet beneath this frenzy lies the same dissatisfaction. Consumption is not recognition. Visibility is not acknowledgement. The hunger persists because the structure of self-consciousness demands something deeper. Self-consciousness requires another self-consciousness. The realization is both liberating and terrifying. To know oneself, one must be recognized by another free being. But recognition is not automatic. It must be earned, risked, fought for. The presence of another consciousness introduces conflict. Each seeks affirmation. Each desires to be absolute center. Mutual dependence clashes with the craving for dominance. At this threshold, consciousness stands on the edge of a new drama. The journey from sensation to perception to understanding has revealed the instability of objectivity. Now the instability invades identity itself. The self is not given. It is achieved. It is mediated. It is fragile. This fragility explains the intensity of human insecurity. We fear rejection because it threatens our very being. We fear invisibility because it erases our reflected self. Beneath ambition lies a metaphysical need. Beneath rivalry lies ontological anxiety. To be ignored is to feel unreal. To be recognized is to feel actual. The common illusion is to imagine that autonomy means independence from others. Hegel dismantles this fantasy. True selfhood emerges through relation, not isolation. The attempt to assert oneself without acknowledging the other leads to distortion. The self becomes tyrannical or hollow. Recognition must be reciprocal, otherwise it collapses into domination. Yet, before reciprocity can be established, consciousness must pass through struggle. The encounter between selves is not harmonious from the start. It is charged with risk. Each wants confirmation without surrender. Each wants to be affirmed as absolute. This tension cannot remain theoretical. It demands confrontation. At this stage, consciousness realizes something profound. The truth it seeks is not merely accurate representation of objects. It is reconciliation between self and other. Knowledge and identity intertwine. To know truly is also to be acknowledged. Epistemology and existence fuse. This insight transforms the meaning of freedom. Freedom is no longer simple independence from constraint. It becomes the capacity to stand before another and remain oneself, while granting the other the same status. This equilibrium is precarious. It requires courage. It requires the willingness to risk oneself. Modern culture speaks endlessly of self-expression, yet self-expression without recognition is monologue. It echoes in emptiness. The digital age multiplies voices, but does not guarantee mutual acknowledgement. One can be seen by thousands and still remain unseen. The structure of self-consciousness has not changed. Only the mediums have. Thus, the journey of consciousness deepens into an ethical terrain. The self cannot complete itself alone. It must enter relation. But relation introduces vulnerability. It introduces the possibility of subjugation. The desire for recognition can harden into the desire to dominate. And when two selves meet, each demanding affirmation, the collision becomes inevitable. Consciousness stands at a threshold where knowledge becomes struggle. The abstract movement of thought now incarnates in lived encounter. The question is no longer merely what is true. It becomes, who am I in the presence of another who also claims to be absolute? The dialectic has moved from object to subject, from perception to identity. It has exposed that selfhood is not an inner possession, but a dynamic achievement. The stage is set for a confrontation that will reveal the cost of recognition, the danger of domination, and the paradox that freedom can only arise through mutual acknowledgement. And as two self-conscious beings lock eyes, each demanding to be affirmed as essential, the tension intensifies into a drama that will redefine what it means to exist at all. Recognition is not a luxury of the ego. It is the condition of existence. When two self-conscious beings confront one another, they do not merely exchange glances, they collide. Each carries within the demand to be affirmed as absolute. Each seeks confirmation that its freedom is not illusion. But if both claim supremacy, who yields? If neither yields, what follows? Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel does not romanticize this encounter. He strips it to its core. Self-consciousness, having discovered that it needs another self-consciousness for validation, enters a struggle. Not a polite negotiation, a risk, a test. Each must prove that it values freedom more than mere survival. Because if you cling to life at all costs, you reveal that your highest truth is biological persistence, not spiritual autonomy. The confrontation becomes existential. To be recognized as free, one must show indifference to death. This is not theatrical heroism. It is structural logic. If I fear losing my life more than losing my dignity, I submit. If I submit, I acknowledge the other as superior. Recognition becomes unequal. Thus emerges the asymmetry. One becomes master, the other becomes servant. The master appears victorious. He has forced recognition. The servant has yielded. The master stands affirmed. But what kind of affirmation is this? Recognition extracted through fear is hollow. It is not freely given. It lacks reciprocity. The master is acknowledged by someone who has been reduced to dependence. This recognition does not satisfy the original demand of self-consciousness, because self-consciousness requires acknowledgement from an equal. Here lies the first inversion. The master seems independent, but depends on the servant's submission. The servant seems dependent, but retains the inner capacity for transformation. Power has shifted, though invisibly. The master consumes, he commands, he enjoys the fruits of labor, yet he does not engage the world directly. He relates to things through the mediation of the servant. His relation to reality becomes indirect. He remains at the level of desire, appropriating without shaping. His independence is fragile. It rests on another's subordination. The servant, by contrast, confronts the world through labor. Forced to work, he shapes raw material. He delays desire. He transforms nature with intention. In doing so, he discovers something profound. Through labor, he externalizes his inner form. He sees himself in the object he has shaped. The world becomes mirror. This is the second inversion. The one who appeared enslaved begins to cultivate genuine self-consciousness. Through disciplined work, he learns patience, skill, foresight. He internalizes fear, but transcends it through activity. The master, insulated from necessity, stagnates. The servant, constrained by necessity, develops. Labor becomes formative, not because it is romantic suffering, but because it forces engagement with resistance. The material world does not yield instantly. It demands effort. Through this process, the servant experiences himself as capable of imposing form upon reality. This is not abstract recognition. It is embodied realization. Modern individuals often misunderstand freedom as absence of constraint. Hegel reveals the opposite. Constraint, when mediated through conscious activity, can generate deeper autonomy. The servant's fear of death initially led to submission, yet that same fear awakens seriousness. It breaks naive immediacy. It forces reflection. Through fear, self-consciousness deepens. Ask yourself, when have you grown most? In comfort or in confrontation? In passive consumption or in disciplined creation? The psyche matures under tension. Anxiety can paralyze, but it can also clarify. The servant's condition exposes the paradox that dependency can become the soil of freedom. Meanwhile, the master's domination reveals its emptiness. He sought recognition, but received only obedience. Obedience is not affirmation. It is compliance. The master remains trapped in a one-sided relation. He cannot see himself in the other as equal. His identity lacks depth. He stands above, but he stands alone. This dynamic is not confined to ancient hierarchies. It permeates modern structures. Corporate leaders demand loyalty, but often receive performance without respect. Public figures accumulate followers, yet remain existentially insecure. Domination does not resolve the hunger for recognition. It amplifies it. Authority without reciprocity breeds isolation. The master-slave dialectic exposes a brutal truth about the human condition. We crave acknowledgement, yet we often seek it through control. We attempt to secure our identity by subordinating others, by silencing dissent, by curating admiration. But coerced recognition cannot stabilize the self. Only mutual recognition can. Consider the internal psychological dimension. Within a single individual, there is often a master and a servant. One part demands superiority. Another part submits out of fear. The ego asserts dominance over vulnerability. Yet suppressed vulnerability returns as resentment. The internal hierarchy mirrors the external one. Without reconciliation, the self fractures. Through labor, the servant acquires something the master lacks: mediation. He understands the process of transformation. He sees that identity is not immediate, but achieved. He grasps that reality is not consumed, but shaped. This experiential knowledge seeds independence. The servant begins to recognize himself not merely as subordinate, but as creator. The master remains tied to dependency on recognition from below. The servant gradually becomes less dependent on the master's acknowledgement. He has discovered himself in his work. He has internalized discipline. He has learned to endure. This endurance becomes strength. Freedom, then, is not granted from above. It emerges from within relation. It requires the courage to confront fear and the discipline to transform constraint into growth. The dialectic does not glorify suffering. It reveals its structural role. Without risk, there is no recognition. Without labor, there is no self-formation. In the world approaching 2025, hierarchies have shifted form, but not essence. Economic systems create new masters and servants. Digital platforms generate asymmetrical visibility. Some command attention. Others labor invisibly. Yet the same logic persists. Those who appear dominant often depend on fragile validation. Those who work within constraints may cultivate deeper resilience. The tragedy is that mutual recognition remains rare. Pride resists equality. Fear resists vulnerability. Each consciousness wants affirmation without surrendering supremacy. But the dialectic shows that supremacy without reciprocity is sterile. True freedom requires acknowledging the other as equally free. This is the ethical breakthrough concealed within their struggle. Recognition must become reciprocal. Each must see the other not as instrument, but as self. Only then does domination dissolve. Only then does freedom cease to be a zero-sum contest. Yet this reciprocity is not automatic. It requires transformation on both sides. The master must relinquish unilateral power. The servant must overcome internalized submission. Both must risk equality. This risk is profound. It threatens established identities. It destabilizes familiar hierarchies. Why is this so difficult? Because domination provides clarity. It simplifies relation into command and obedience. Reciprocity introduces ambiguity. It demands dialogue. It requires listening. It exposes one's own limits. It demands recognition of another's interiority. That is harder than ruling. The master-slave dynamic thus becomes more than historical metaphor. It becomes existential structure. In intimate relationships, in workplaces, in politics, the tension reappears. Who defines the terms? Who depends on whose acknowledgement? Where is fear shaping submission? Where is pride blocking equality? To confront these questions is to confront oneself. Do you seek recognition through control? Do you measure your worth by others' compliance? Or have you endured the discipline that allows you to stand without domination? The dialectic demands honesty. It strips away moral self-deception. Ultimately, the struggle reveals that freedom is relational. It cannot exist in isolation. A solitary self may imagine autonomy, but without another free being to acknowledge it, that autonomy remains abstract. Recognition must circulate. It must be mutual. Only then does self-consciousness stabilize. This stabilization, however, is not final rest. It opens a wider horizon. Once recognition becomes reciprocal, the question shifts. How can such recognition be institutionalized? How can freedom move beyond individual encounters and take objective form? The drama between two selves gestures toward a larger structure where subject and object, individual and community, begin to intertwine within a living totality that seeks to know itself not only through struggle, but through a system capable of holding all contradictions within a higher unity. The Absolute is not a distant God beyond the world. It is the world coming to know itself. What appears fragmented, accidental, chaotic is in truth a self-unfolding whole. The struggle for recognition, the inversion of master and servant, the slow birth of reciprocal freedom were never isolated episodes. They were moments in a larger movement. The drama between selves was the Absolute testing its own limits through division. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel dares to state what few philosophers risk. Reality is not a collection of independent substances, but a living totality. Before systems theory, before modern psychology spoke of integration, before history was understood as structured development, he declared that the real is rational and the rational is real. This is not naive optimism. It is a demand to see the inner necessity within what seems contingent. The absolute is not a thing. It is not an object hidden behind appearances. It is process. It is the movement through which subject and object, knower and known, individual and community, gradually recognize their unity. To misunderstand this is to reduce the absolute to metaphysical ornament. Hegel strips it of mysticism and reveals it as dynamic self-relation. First, reality is a self-moving whole. Nothing stands isolated. Every event, every institution, every consciousness participates in a web of relations. The error of fragmented thinking is to treat parts as independent units. Yet each part derives its meaning from its place within the whole. Remove it from that structure, and it becomes distortion. The master made this error when he believed himself independent of the servant. The servant's labor revealed the hidden interdependence. So too with history, culture, and thought. The absolute is this interdependence grasped as necessary movement. Second, subject and object are not fundamentally separate. Consciousness initially opposes itself to the world. It says, I am here, the object is there. But through the stages of sense certainty, perception, understanding, and self-consciousness, this opposition erodes. The structures discovered in the world mirror the structures of thought. The struggle for recognition reveals that identity forms through relation. The boundary between inner and outer becomes porous. The absolute is the insight that reality is not alien to mind. It is mind externalized and returning to itself. This does not mean that the world is a private projection. It means that rational structure permeates both thought and being. When science uncovers law, it does not impose order on chaos. It articulates an order that was already operative. When self-consciousness recognizes another, it does not fabricate meaning. It uncovers a shared rationality. The unity of subject and object is not fusion without distinction. It is mediated identity. Each retains difference, yet both belong to a larger coherence. Third, system is not rigidity, but living articulation. Many recoil at the word system. It suggests closure, dogma, suffocation. But Hegel's system is not a prison. It is organism. In an organism, each organ has function only within the whole. Remove the heart, and it ceases to be heart. Remove consciousness from its historical context, and it becomes abstraction. The absolute is system in this organic sense, structured, differentiated, yet internally related. The misunderstanding is to imagine that system eliminates freedom. On the contrary, without structure, freedom dissolves into chaos. Reciprocal recognition requires stable forms. Labor requires shared norms. Community requires institutions. The absolute integrates these without reducing them to static formula. It is movement through structured mediation. Fourth, The Absolute is process, not finished object. It does not sit beyond time. It unfolds through time. Each stage of consciousness, each social formation, each philosophical articulation is a moment in its self-realization. This is why contradiction is not anomaly, it is mortar. When a form exhausts its capacity, it negates itself and gives birth to a richer configuration. The Absolute does not avoid negativity, it passes through it. This passage through negativity is crucial. Without it, the Absolute would be inert perfection. Instead, it is living reconciliation. The master-slave struggle was negativity. The fragmentation of consciousness was negativity, yet each contributed to higher integration. The Absolute includes failure, conflict, alienation as necessary phases. It is not pure light untouched by shadow. It is light that emerges through shadow. For the modern individual, this vision is unsettling. We are trained to see ourselves as isolated agents navigating an indifferent universe. The Absolute confronts this narrative. It says, your thoughts, your struggles, your relationships are not random accidents. They participate in a broader unfolding of spirit. This does not erase responsibility, it intensifies it. Because if you are moment of a larger process, your actions contribute to its shape. In the era approaching 2025, fragmentation dominates discourse. Identities harden into camps. Institutions lose legitimacy. Knowledge splinters into specialized silos. It appears as if unity is impossible. Yet, the dialectical lens suggests something deeper. These fractures may signal not collapse, but transition. When a structure can no longer integrate its contradictions, it must transform. The Absolute does not bypass crisis. It works through it. Psychologically, this insight reorients self-understanding. Many experience inner division as failure, conflicting desires, incompatible roles, moral uncertainty. We interpret these as signs of weakness. Hegel would see them as moments in integration. The self is not born unified. It becomes unified by traversing contradiction. Suppressing tension halts development. Engaging it advances wholeness. The Absolute thus operates both historically and inwardly. It is the totality of relations that gradually come to self-awareness. When consciousness recognizes its dependence on recognition, it participates in this totality. When labor transforms nature and reflects selfhood, it participates. When domination collapses into reciprocity, it participates. The Absolute is not elsewhere. It is this very movement. Yet a question presses. If the Absolute is self-knowing totality, how does it attain clarity? How does it become transparent to itself? System requires articulation. The unity of subject and object must be thought explicitly. Otherwise it remains implicit, lived but not comprehended. Philosophy emerges at this point as the self-reflection of spirit. But philosophy does not invent the Absolute. It recognizes what history has already enacted. The living system precedes its conceptual expression. Thought comes late, like dusk reflecting on the day. Yet once articulated, the system gains new depth. It becomes conscious of its own structure. Here another danger appears: to mistake the system for finality, to imagine that once articulated, development ceases. Hegel resists this. The Absolute is not static blueprint. It is dynamic coherence. Each articulation is itself moment within further unfolding. Self-knowledge does not freeze reality. It refines its awareness. Consider again the master and servant. Their reconciliation would not end history. It would inaugurate new forms of relation requiring institutional embodiment. Freedom must take shape in family, economy, polity. Recognition must stabilize beyond personal encounter. The Absolute presses toward objectivity. Thus, the movement from individual self-consciousness to communal structures is not accidental. It is necessary. The unity of subject and object demands social form. Freedom cannot remain private experience. It must inhabit shared institutions. The Absolute seeks embodiment. At this threshold, we sense the expansion of scope. Consciousness is no longer merely individual awareness. It becomes spirit, living in customs, laws, language, culture. The unity previously glimpsed between knower and known begins to widen into historical reality. The Absolute stretches beyond interpersonal struggle toward comprehensive articulation of logic, nature, and spirit. And as this widening occurs, a deeper foundation demands examination. If the Absolute is rational process, what is the structure of that rationality itself? What is the inner architecture that governs being, nothing, becoming, concept? To grasp the living whole, one must descend into the pure movement of thought that underlies every stage, where existence and negation intertwine at the most elemental level, and where the logic of reality reveals itself before it appears as world. Pure being is indistinguishable from nothing. This is not poetic exaggeration. It is the most radical claim of logic. When thought attempts to grasp being in its absolute purity, stripped of all determination, it finds emptiness. Pure being has no quality, no content, no distinction. It is sheer immediacy. But sheer immediacy, without any feature, cannot be distinguished from pure nothing. The attempt to think absolute presence collapses into absence. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel begins not with the world of objects or the drama of recognition, but with the barest movement of thought itself. Before nature, before spirit, before institutions. He descends into the inner architecture of logic. Because if the Absolute is rational process, its skeleton must be exposed. Logic is not formal manipulation of symbols. It is the pulse of reality in its most abstract form. First, pure being dissolves into nothing. We imagine being as the most solid foundation. We say something is. We trust the word as if it were ultimate ground. Yet when being is stripped of every determination, what remains? No color, no shape, no duration, no difference, only indeterminate immediacy. This emptiness cannot be held. The mind, attempting to fix it, finds that it has grasped nothing at all. The concept implodes. The common misunderstanding is to treat nothing as mere negation of something concrete. But here, nothing is not the absence of a specific thing. It is pure indeterminacy. It is identical to pure being in its lack of content. The shock is deliberate. Hegel forces thought to confront its own obstruction. If you seek absolute beginning, you encounter a void. Second, from this tension emerges becoming. Being and nothing are not static opposites. They pass into each other. The vanishing of being into nothing and nothing into being is a movement. That movement is becoming. Becoming is not external change imposed on stable substances. It is the primordial oscillation at the heart of logic. It is the unity of being and nothing in dynamic transition. This insight overturns metaphysical dogmatism. Reality is not composed of inert blocks of existence. At its core lies process. Becoming precedes fixed entities. What appears stable is sedimented movement. The tree, the institution, the self are crystallizations of ongoing transformation. Logic reveals that change is not secondary. It is fundamental. Third, determination arises through negation. To determine something is to say what it is not. Identity requires boundary. A thing is this because it excludes that. Negation is not enemy of being. It is its condition. Without negation, being remains indeterminate emptiness. Through negation, difference appears. Through difference, structure forms. Here the dialectical engine intensifies. Every determination carries its own limitation. To be something specific is to exclude other possibilities. This exclusion generates tension. The finite contains within itself the impulse toward its own transcendence, because what is limited points beyond itself. It is defined by what it lacks. The misunderstanding is to imagine limitation as mere defect. Hegel reveals it as motor. The finite does not collapse because it is limited. It moves. It seeks completion. The concept unfolds because it cannot remain confined within narrow determination. Logic is alive. Fourth, the concept develops itself. Concept is not static definition. It is self-mediating structure. In everyday language, we treat concepts as labels attached to objects. Hegel inverts this relation. The concept is generative. It articulates the inner necessity through which determinations arise and interrelate. When fully grasped, the concept is unity of universality, particularity, and individuality. It is not abstract generality. It is concrete totality. This is why thought and being are not alien domains. The logical structures uncovered in pure thinking correspond to the structures of reality. When logic moves from being to nothing to becoming, it is not playing with empty forms. It is tracing the inner grammar of existence. The identity of thought and being does not mean that everything is subjective fantasy. It means that rational structure permeates both. Modern skepticism often assumes that thought can never access reality as it is. We are told that our concepts distort the world, that language traps us in subjective frameworks. Hegel's response is uncompromising. If reality were utterly alien to thought, knowledge would be impossible. The very act of doubting presupposes rational coherence. Logic is not prison. It is medium of intelligibility. In the world approaching 2025, data floods consciousness. Algorithms classify, predict, optimize. Yet beneath this technological complexity lies the same logical architecture. Distinctions are made, negations applied, patterns recognized. The digital universe rests upon binary differentiation, upon structured determination. Even artificial systems mirror the deeper logic of being and nothing, presence and absence, signal and null. Technology amplifies logical structure. It does not escape it. Psychologically, the movement from being through nothing to becoming mirrors inner life. We often cling to identities as fixed substances. I am this, I am not that. Yet when crisis strips away our roles, we experience emptiness. The collapse of a career, a relationship, a belief can feel like nothingness. But this nothingness is not final annihilation. It is transitional space. Becoming emerges from dissolution. The self reforms at higher articulation. Negativity terrifies because it threatens stability. Yet logic reveals that without negativity, no development occurs. Pure positivity is emptiness. Only through negation does richness arise. This applies to institutions as well. A political system that refuses reform ossifies. A culture that denies critique decays. The finite must encounter its limits to evolve. The concept in its maturity integrates these movements. It is not merely abstract unity, but living self-reference. It contains universality as common structure, particularity as differentiated expression, individuality as concrete realization. This triadic articulation is not mechanical formula. It is dynamic necessity. Remove any moment and coherence collapses. Thought becomes aware of its own power, not as arbitrary creator, but as participant in rational unfolding. Logic, far from being called formalism, reveals the warmth of process. It shows that reality is intelligible because it is structured by self-relating negativity and mediated unity. At this level, the absolute appears not as distant whole, but as logical self-development. The system is grounded in pure thought. Before nature externalizes logic into space and time, before spirit embodies logic and consciousness in institutions, the architecture must be clear. Being, nothing, becoming, determination, concept. These are not academic categories. They are the bones of reality. Yet logic in its purity remains abstract. It reveals structure but not yet external existence. The movement from indeterminate being to concrete concept prepares for manifestation. If thought and being are identical in structure, this identity must express itself beyond abstraction. Logic must step outside itself. This stepping outside is not error, it is necessity. The concept, fully articulated, cannot remain enclosed in pure thinking. It must externalize. It must appear as other to itself. The rational structure that unfolded in abstraction seeks embodiment. It becomes nature. Here the tension intensifies again, for when logic becomes external, it seems to lose its transparency. It disperses into material multiplicity. Space, time, life, limitation emerge. The clarity of pure thought enters the opacity of extension and finitude. The absolute moves from self-contained rationality into estrangement. And so, the inquiry shifts from the invisible skeleton of logic to the visible body of the world, where idea takes on spatial form, where necessity appears as natural law, and where life struggles within the constraints of externality, waiting to rediscover in organic striving the rational pulse that first stirred within pure being itself. Nature is the idea estranged from itself. What was transparent in logic becomes opaque in space. What was self-contained concept becomes external multiplicity. The movement that began with pure being now stands dispersed across stars, stones, oceans, bodies. The rational has stepped outside itself. It has taken the form of otherness. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel does not treat nature as dead matter opposed to thought. He refuses the dualism that fractures reality into mind here and world there. Nature is not alien to logic. It is logic in the mode of externality. The idea, having unfolded its inner necessity in pure thought, now appears in spatial dispersion, in temporal succession, in contingency. It is the same rational structure, but now scattered. First, nature is the externalization of the idea. In logic, determinations passed into one another with transparent necessity. In nature, that necessity seems concealed. Objects appear indifferent to each other. They occupy space side by side. They obey laws, yet they do not know those laws. The unity that logic grasped internally now manifests as external relation. This externality is not error, it is stage. The idea must confront itself as other. Only through this estrangement can it return enriched. Nature is this necessary alienation. The concept becomes spatial. Time unfolds as succession. Causality appears as mechanical interaction. The misunderstanding is to reduce nature to mere brute fact. Scientific materialism often claims that matter is ultimate, that consciousness emerges accidentally from blind processes. Hegel reverses the hierarchy. Nature is not foundation beneath thought. It is thought externalized. Its apparent blindness is moment within larger self-articulation. Second, natural existence is marked by limitation. Every natural thing is finite. It occupies a determinate space. It persists for determinate time. It is vulnerable to dissolution. The mountain erodes. The organism ages. The star burns out. Finitude is written into the fabric of natural being. Limitation is not flaw. It is structure. To be determinate is to exclude. To exclude is to be finite. Nature embodies the logic of determination in concrete form. Each entity is bounded. Each bears within itself the seeds of its negation. Decay is not anomaly, it is necessity. This finitude reveals something profound. Nature cannot achieve absolute self-coincidence. It cannot fully reconcile with itself. Its processes remain external. Forces collide. Organisms struggle. Equilibrium is temporary. There is order, but it lacks self-awareness. Nature is rational, but not yet conscious of its rationality. Third, Life emerges as higher articulation within nature. In the living organism, the externality of parts gives way to organic unity. The heart, lungs, brain do not merely coexist side by side. They function for and through the whole. The organism maintains itself. It metabolizes environment. It resists dissolution. Life represents inwardness within externality. The organism is not passive object. It actively sustains itself. It transforms external matter into its own substance. In doing so, it anticipates spirit. Yet it remains confined. Its unity is immediate, not conceptual. It lives, but it does not know that it lives. Here, the tension intensifies. Life strives against limitation. It seeks self-preservation, yet death remains inevitable. The organism cannot escape finitude. Its very individuality guarantees its end. Death is not external accident. It is internal necessity. The finite cannot sustain itself indefinitely. Modern culture fears death with obsessive intensity. We medicalize it, we conceal it, we treat it as scandal. But within the logic of nature, death is structural. It reviews the limit of natural existence. It exposes that nature, in its immediacy, cannot secure permanence. The living being cannot achieve the self-transparency that logic possessed. Psychologically, this mirrors the anxiety of embodiment. We experience ourselves as conscious, yet tied to fragile flesh. We desire permanence, yet inhabit mortality. The body situates us within nature's finitude. Hunger, fatigue, illness remind us that we are not pure thought. We are natural beings. In the era approaching 2025, technology promises to extend life, to optimize health, to manipulate biology. Yet no innovation abolishes finitude. At most, it shifts its boundaries. The structure remains. Natural existence is limited. The dream of infinite extension within nature is illusion. Because limitation is not contingent defect. It is essence of the natural. Nature also reveals contingency. In logic, determinations followed with necessity. In nature, chance appears. This tree grows here, not there. This species survives, another vanishes. Laws operate, yet their outcomes scatter across innumerable configurations. The rational structure underlies, but surface appears irregular. This irregularity tempts reductionism. Some conclude that randomness is ultimate truth. Others retreat into mystical reverence for nature as ineffable other. Hegel refuses both. Contingency is real, but it is moment within necessity. Externality generates multiplicity. Multiplicity produces variation. Yet the underlying structure persists. The inadequacy of nature lies not in its beauty or power. It lies in its lack of self-knowledge. The mountain does not know it embodies gravitational law. The organism does not comprehend its own organic unity. The rational remains implicit. The idea is present, but unconscious. This unconscious rationality prepares the emergence of something new. Within life, a threshold appears. Sensation, impulse, instinct begin to internalize external stimuli. The organism reacts not merely mechanically, but through integrated response, the seeds of subjectivity germinate. Consider the animal. It moves toward nourishment, away from threat. It exhibits interiority, yet its consciousness remains tied to immediate drives. It does not universalize. It does not conceptualize its world. Its inwardness is still immersed in nature. The transition from nature to spirit hinges on this difference. Nature externalizes logic without awareness. Spirit will internalize nature and recognize itself within it. The body becomes medium of consciousness. The finite organism becomes bearer of self-reflection. Before this transition occurs, the limitations of nature must be exhausted. Externality must show its insufficiency. Life must reveal both its unity and its fragility. Death must demonstrate that natural individuality cannot secure absolute meaning. Only then can a higher form arise. The temptation is to romanticize nature as harmonious whole. But harmony without awareness is incomplete. Nature balances forces, but it does not choose. It cycles, but it does not interpret. Its unity is immediate, not mediated by concept. It lacks freedom. Freedom requires self-relation. It requires the capacity to stand back from impulse and determine oneself. Nature cannot do this. It operates through necessity, not self-determined rationality. Even the most complex ecosystem remains bound to external causality. This recognition should not diminish nature. It clarifies its place. Nature is an indispensable stage in the unfolding of the absolute. It is the theater in which rational structure becomes concrete. It provides the material substrate for spirit, but it is not final. The human being embodies this transition. As natural organism, we are subject to hunger, pain, aging. As potential spirit, we transcend immediate drives through reflection. We are nature becoming aware of itself. The tension between body and mind is not dualistic accident. It is dialectical necessity. Within us, the idea confronts its own externalization. We feel divided. Instinct pulls. Reason resists. The conflict is not pathology. It is a sign that spirit is emerging from nature. The same logic that moved from being to becoming now moves from life to self-consciousness. And as this movement intensifies, the focus shifts from the structures of external reality to the interior structures of human awareness. Nature has revealed limitation, contingency, mortality. Yet within the natural organism, a new dimension stirs, one that can reflect upon its own finitude and seek freedom beyond mere survival. A dimension that will unfold not in forests or oceans, but within language, culture, and institutions, where spirit begins to recognize itself as more than nature alone. Spirit is nature that has awakened to itself. The body breathes, ages, hungers, but within that fragile organism, something stands back and says, I. This simple word fractures the closed circle of nature. Instinct no longer reigns alone. Relationship intervenes. The human being is not merely alive. The human being knows that it lives. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel names this emergence spirits. Not ghost, not mystical vapor. Spirit is self-relating freedom embodied in a living being. Nature externalized the idea without awareness. Spirit internalizes nature and recognizes itself as the bearer of rationality. The transition is decisive. The absolute begins to speak. First, spirit appears as subjective spirit. This is the inner life of the individual. Sensation becomes perception. Perception becomes thought. Desire becomes intention. The human being does not simply react to stimuli. It interprets. It judges. It remembers. The psyche is no longer submerged in environment. It creates distance. This distance is the birth of freedom. To stand back from impulse is to loosen its tyranny. The animal feels hunger and eats. The human feels hunger and can fast. The gap between drive and action is the space of self-determination. Yet this space is fragile. It must be cultivated. Without education, without discipline, freedom collapses into caprice. The misunderstanding of modern culture is to equate freedom with spontaneity. Do what you feel. Follow your impulse. But impulse belongs to nature. Spirit demands mediation. It demands reflection. True freedom is not the absence of constraint. It is the capacity to give oneself law. Subjective spirit develops through stages. Consciousness learns to distinguish itself from world. It acquires language. It forms memory. It constructs concepts. These are not decorative skills. They are structures of interiority. Through them, the individual becomes capable of universal thought. Private sensation gives way to shared meaning. Yet subjective spirit cannot complete itself alone. The individual who retreats into pure inwardness stagnates. Self-consciousness requires recognition. The master and servant revealed this truth. Identity is not sealed within the skull. It unfolds between selves. Thus, spirit must move beyond subjectivity into objectivity. Freedom must take shape in institutions. The individual alone is abstract. Only within a community does freedom become concrete. Second, objective spirit arises as the network of social relations in which freedom is embodied. Family, civil society, state. These are not artificial constructions imposed from outside. They are the necessary forms through which spirit realizes itself. The child is born into family before it understands itself. Through familial love, it first experiences unity that is not mere instinct, but ethical bond. Family is immediate ethical life. It is unity grounded in feeling. Yet it cannot remain closed. The child matures. Individuality differentiates. The family dissolves into plurality. This plurality enters civil society, the realm of economic exchange, legal relations, competition, cooperation. Civil society is complex. It is field of needs. Individuals pursue private interests. They depend on one another through labor and exchange. It is here that the lessons of the servant return. Work shapes identity. Mutual dependence becomes visible. Yet civil society also generates inequality, conflict, alienation. It cannot by itself guarantee justice. The error is to absolutize either family intimacy or market autonomy. One dissolves individuality, the other fragments community. Objective spirit requires higher unity. It requires an institution capable of integrating particular interests into universal order. Third, the state emerges as embodiment of rational freedom. This claim is easily misunderstood. It does not sanctify any existing regime. It does not justify tyranny. The rational state is not police apparatus crushing dissent. It is the structured expression of ethical life, in which individual freedom aligns with universal good. Freedom here is not mere option. It is participation in shared rational order. Law is not external constraint, but articulation of common will. When citizens recognize themselves in the laws they obey, obedience is not servitude, it is self-realization. Modern suspicion of institutions often springs from historical abuses. States have oppressed, laws have excluded, but the abuse of form does not invalidate its necessity. Without institutional embodiment, freedom remains abstract ideal. The master-slave struggle would repeat endlessly without mediating structures. In the world approaching 2025, individuals oscillate between radical individualism and distrust of authority. Some worship personal choice as ultimate value. Others seek security in strong leadership. Both extremes misunderstand freedom. Freedom without universality dissolves into chaos. Universality without recognition degenerates into domination. Objective spirit demands balance. The individual must see the universal as expression of its own rational will. This requires education, civic participation, shared culture. It requires that institutions remain open to critique and reform. Because spirit is living, not frozen, psychologically, this movement from subjective to objective spirit mirrors maturation. The child experiences family as total world. The adolescent rebels, asserting individuality. The mature adult recognizes that personal freedom is intertwined with social structures. Responsibility replaces impulsive autonomy. Spirit thus overcomes the immediate unity of nature and the isolated interiority of subjective self. It inhabits language, law, custom. It becomes historical. Each generation inherits institutions shaped by predecessors. Each modifies them. Spirit accumulates experience. Yet institutions are not static. When they fail to embody rational freedom, contradiction intensifies, alienation resurfaces, civil society fractures, the state loses legitimacy. Spirit must then reform its own structures. The dialectic continues within ethical life. Freedom achieved through institutions is higher than freedom imagined in isolation. It is mediated freedom. The individual acts not merely from impulse, but within rational framework that protects others' freedom as well. Reciprocity becomes structural, not accidental. But this structural embodiment raises new questions. If spirit lives in institutions, how does it comprehend itself fully? How does it rise above particular customs and grasp its own universal movement? Ethical life provides concrete freedom, yet spirit seeks transparency. Within culture, art begins to express shared meanings in sensuous form. Religion symbolizes the unity of human and divine. Philosophy articulates the concept explicitly. Spirit moves toward absolute self-knowledge. Yet before reaching that culmination, it must confront the rational structure of its own institutions more deeply. It must examine the nature of political freedom. the ethical substance of law, the relation between individual conscience and universal order. Because the state, as rational embodiment of freedom, demands scrutiny. It cannot rest on inherited authority alone. And as spirit reflects upon its own institutional forms, as it questions whether its laws truly express universal will or merely particular power, it steps into a sharper arena where freedom must be reconciled not only with community, but with rational necessity itself, where ethical life seeks its highest articulation in a form that claims to embody reason without suppressing individuality. Freedom is not the right to do whatever one wants. It is the will aligned with reason. This claim cuts against the instinct of the age. We equate freedom with choice, with options multiplied, with constraints removed. Yet, choice without rational structure collapses into arbitrariness. To act on impulse is not to be free. It is to be ruled by what one has not examined. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel pushes the concept of ethical life to its sharpest edge in the idea of the state. Not the state as bureaucratic machinery, not the state as coercive apparatus, the state as the living embodiment of rational freedom. This is dangerous language if misunderstood. It demands precision. First, ethical life is not abstract morality. Morality in the narrow sense concerns individual conscience, private intention, personal conviction. Ethical life is thicker. It is the fabric of shared norms, institutions, practices, through which freedom becomes objective. It is freedom made durable. Family offered immediate unity. Civil society exposed the clash of private interests. The state integrates both into higher order. It does not erase individuality. It secures it. Without law, rights dissolve into power. Without universal institutions, private freedom becomes fragile privilege. The misunderstanding is to treat the state as external limit on freedom. Hegel inverts this. The rational state is condition of freedom. Law, when rational, does not impose alien will. It expresses the universal dimension of one's own will. To obey such law is not to submit to another. It is to recognize oneself in the universal. But this recognition is not automatic. It requires education of spirit. Citizens must see beyond private advantage. They must grasp that their individuality depends upon stable structures. Freedom detached from universality is contradiction. It consumes itself. Second, positive freedom surpasses negative liberty. Negative liberty means absence of interference. No one stops me. No one commands me. Yet this form of freedom is empty if I lack the means to realize my capacities. A starving person is formally free, yet practically constrained. A citizen without access to participation is legally equal, yet politically marginal. Positive freedom means participation in shaping the universal. It means seeing oneself as co-author of the laws under which one lives. This requires institutions that mediate between private interests and common good. Representation, deliberation, public discourse, not as spectacle, but as rational process. In the world approaching 2025, Political discourse often swings between libertarian individualism and authoritarian consolidation. One side distrusts all structure. The other glorifies centralized power. Both misunderstand rational freedom. Structure without participation suffocates. Participation without structure disintegrates. The rational state must hold contradiction without collapsing into repression. It must integrate diversity without erasing difference. This is not sentimental harmony. It is disciplined mediation. The universal must be concrete enough to respect particular identities, yet firm enough to prevent fragmentation. Third, the state embodies ethical substance. Ethical substance is not mere collection of rules. It is shared understanding of what counts as just, honorable, legitimate. When institutions align with this substance, citizens experience coherence. When institutions diverge from it, alienation intensifies. Alienation is not simply economic deprivation. It is the sense that laws no longer reflect one's rational will. When people obey out of fear or resignation, recognition fails. The master-slave dynamic returns at systemic level. Domination replaces reciprocity. Hegel's vision is often caricatured as blind obedience to authority. This is false. The rational state is not immune to critique. Because spirit is living, institutions must remain open to reform. If they ossify, they betray their rational foundation. The state must embody not only order, but self-correction. Psychologically, this reflects the maturation of conscience. At early stages, morality is external command. Later, it becomes internal principle. In its highest form, individual conscience recognizes itself within shared rational norms. The opposition between private conviction and public law diminishes. Yet this harmony is fragile. Modern consciousness is deeply individualistic. Suspicion toward institutions runs high. Historical abuses haunt collective memory. The challenge is to rebuild trust without naivety, to affirm rational universality without ignoring power distortions. Hegel's claim that the state is the actuality of the ethical idea does not sanctify existing governments. It sets criterion. A state that suppresses freedom, silences dissent, denies participation, contradicts its own concept. It fails to embody rationality. The danger lies in mistaking empirical state for rational state. The concept demands that institutions mediate between subjective freedom and universal order. Where this mediation fails, contradiction intensifies. Reform becomes necessary. Fourth, freedom as participation in the universal reshapes identity. The citizen is not merely consumer of rights. The citizen is bearer of responsibility. Voting, deliberating, obeying law, paying taxes. These are not burdens imposed by alien force. They are modes of belonging to rational whole. Belonging here is not tribal loyalty. It is conscious identification with universal structure that secures freedom for all. When citizens withdraw into private spheres, when public life is treated as spectacle rather than shared task, ethical life weakens. In the era approaching 2025, digital networks fragment attention. Echo chambers replace public discourse. Information spreads without deliberation. The temptation is to retreat into micro-communities defined by identity alone. Yet rational freedom requires broader integration. Without common horizon, the universal disintegrates. The state must therefore cultivate civic virtue, not indoctrination, but education in rational participation. Citizens must learn to see law not as enemy, but as expression of shared will. This demands transparency, accountability, dialogue. Freedom is heavy. It demands maturity. It demands capacity to transcend narrow interest. Hegel does not flatter humanity. He assumes development. Spirit grows through conflict, reform, reflection. The rational state is not achieved once and for all. It is an ongoing project. The ethical life embodied in institutions prepares spirit for a broader horizon. The individual now experiences freedom not only in private conscience, but in public order. Recognition extends beyond interpersonal encounter into systemic structure. Yet even this is not ultimate, because the state, though rational, remains finite form. It exists within history. It rises and declines. It confronts external others. Its institutions reflect specific cultural configurations. Spirit cannot rest here. It must comprehend its own historical movement. If ethical life is embodiment of freedom within a particular community, history is the arena in which freedom unfolds across communities. The rational state participates in larger drama. Its emergence, transformation, and sometimes collapse reveal deeper pattern. Thus the question expands: how does spirit move through epochs? How do conflicts between nations, revolutions, reforms contribute to development of freedom? Is history mere sequence of accidents, or does rationality operate within its turbulence? To grasp the state fully, one must situate it within temporal process, where freedom gradually becomes conscious of itself on a global scale, and where the cunning of reason weaves individual passions into the fabric of universal development. History is not chaos. It is freedom becoming conscious of itself. At first glance, history appears as violence, ambition, accident. Empires rise and fall. Revolutions ignite and consume. Leaders emerge, dominate, vanish. We are tempted to see only contingency. Yet beneath this turbulence, a deeper movement unfolds. Spirit does not wander blindly through time. It advances. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel refuses the comforting illusion that history is guided by moral purity. He also rejects the cynical claim that it is nothing but brute power. History is rational, but its rationality is not gentle. It is the development of freedom through conflict. First, history is the progression of the consciousness of freedom, not the immediate possession of freedom, but its awareness. In ancient despotisms, only one was free. The ruler stood above law. The masses obeyed. Freedom existed, but it was concentrated, not universal. In classical antiquity, some were free. Citizenship emerged. Participation expanded. Yet slaves remained excluded. Freedom widened, but remained partial. Modernity introduces a radical claim: all are free, not merely as moral sentiment, but as principle. This principle is not self-evident gift. It is hard-won insight. It emerges through centuries of struggle, reform, revolution. The idea that every human being possesses inherent dignity is historical achievement. The misunderstanding is to treat this principle as timeless axiom, discovered once and for all. Hegel insists that consciousness of freedom develops gradually. Spirit learns through failure. Institutions that once seemed rational reveal their limits. New forms arise. Second, social contradiction drives development. Conflict is not accidental disturbance. It is motor. When existing structures can no longer integrate emerging demands for recognition, tension escalates. Economic inequality, political exclusion, cultural repression, these generate crises. Crisis forces transformation. The master-slave dynamic returns at collective scale. Classes confront one another. Nations struggle. Ideals clash with realities. Each conflict exposes inadequacy of previous order. The resolution does not erase tension. It reorganizes it at higher level. In the world approaching 2025, global interconnectedness intensifies contradiction. Technological expansion collides with ethical uncertainty. Democratic ideals confront authoritarian resurgence. Economic interdependence amplifies inequality. These are not random anomalies. They are signs that spirit is wrestling with new configurations of freedom. Third, individuals serve reason without knowing it. This is the infamous cunning of reason. Historical actors pursue personal ambitions. Conquerors seek glory. Reformers seek justice. Entrepreneurs seek profit. Yet their actions often produce consequences beyond intention. The universal emerges through particular passion. This is not fatalism. It does not reduce individuals to puppets. It reveals that subjective motives are woven into larger pattern. A revolutionary may fight for personal vindication, yet ignite structural change. A ruler may seek expansion, yet inadvertently spread institutional forms that outlast him. The cunning of reason is unsettling. It suggests that spirit uses even egoism as instrument. The tragedy of history lies here. Great individuals often burn brightly and perish. Their lives are sacrificed to movements larger than themselves. Freedom advances, but not without cost. Psychologically, this mirrors inner development. We pursue desires only to discover later that they shaped us in unforeseen ways. A failure redirects a life. A loss awakens depth. What seemed meaningless event becomes pivot of growth. Reason operates beneath conscious intention, yet this does not justify cruelty. Hegel does not celebrate suffering. He recognizes its structural role. History is not moral fairy tale. It is process in which negativity is metabolized into progress. The danger is to romanticize violence as necessary. Rational comprehension must not become ethical indifference. Fourth, historical understanding is collective self-recognition. To study history is not to memorize dates. It is to see oneself as participant in unfolding of freedom. Nations are not static entities. They are moments in world spirit's journey. Each culture embodies particular articulation of rationality. None is final. The temptation of nationalism is to absolutize one's own moment, to treat one's institutions as culmination of history. This is illusion. Spirit moves. Forms that once expressed freedom can become obstacles. Clinging to outdated structures freezes development. In the era approaching 2025, historical consciousness is fragmented. Information circulates instantly, yet deep understanding declines. Narratives polarize. Memory becomes weapon. Without shared interpretation, spirit risks losing coherence. History becomes battleground of competing myths rather than medium of self-knowledge. True historical awareness requires courage. It demands acknowledgement of injustice without surrendering belief in rational progress. It demands recognition that one's own society is transitional, not ultimate. It demands humility before the complexity of development. Freedom as historical achievement is fragile. Rights can erode. Institutions can decay. The consciousness of freedom must be renewed in each generation. Spirit does not coast. It advances through active participation. The rationality of history does not guarantee linear ascent. There are regressions. There are catastrophes. But even regression reveals contradiction that cannot be sustained indefinitely. Oppression generates resistance. Stagnation provokes reform. Spirit does not remain indefinitely in forms that contradict its own principle. The modern individual often feels powerless before historical forces. Global markets, geopolitical tensions, technological acceleration. Yet history is not abstract mechanism. It is the activity of individuals embedded in institutions. To recognize oneself as participant in rational development is to recover agency. Agency here is not isolated heroism. It is engagement with universal aims, reforming unjust law, defending rights, building institutions, contributing to discourse. Each action enters fabric of history. The cunning of reason operates through concrete deeds. There is, however, a deeper dimension. History as progression of freedom prepares spirit for reflection on its own highest expressions. Political freedom is significant, yet it is not ultimate articulation of spirit. Even the most rational state remains bound to time. It exists within sequence of events. It can be surpassed. If history reveals development of freedom, spirit must ask, how does it comprehend this development fully? Through what forms does it grasp its own movement? Ethical life embodied freedom in institutions. His history displayed freedom unfolding through epochs. But spirit seeks self-transparency beyond political structure and temporal succession. It turns toward art, where truth appears in sensuous form. It turns toward religion, where truth is imagined in symbolic narrative. It turns toward philosophy, where truth is articulated conceptually. These are not decorative additions to political life. They are the highest expressions of spirit's need to know itself. Before spirit can rest, it must see its own face, not only in laws and revolutions, but in beauty, in worship, in thought itself. Because the Absolute, having externalized itself in nature and institutionalized itself in ethical life, now demands complete self-clarity. And that clarity requires a mode of expression where subject and object, history and concept converge in the self-illumination of spirit. Art does not decorate truth. It reveals it in sensuous form. When spirit seeks to see itself, it does not begin with abstract theory. It begins with image, rhythm, shape. Before philosophy speaks in pure concepts, art lets the absolute shine through stone, color, sound. Truth appears not as argument, but as presence. The marble statue, the tragic drama, the cathedral rising toward the sky do not merely please the senses. They embody spirit's attempt to recognize itself. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel understands art as moment in the self-unfolding of absolute spirit, not entertainment, not subjective expression detached from reality. Art is the stage at which truth becomes visible, tangible, immediate. The idea, which passed through logic, externalized itself in nature, embodied itself in ethical life and history, now seeks self-knowledge through beauty. First, art expresses truth through sensuous intuition. The infinite appears in finite form. A sculpture captures human dignity in stone. A symphony renders inner conflict audible. A painting suspends time and lets spirit contemplate itself. The content of art is not arbitrary emotion. It is the universal rendered particular. The misunderstanding of modern aesthetics is to reduce art to personal feeling, as if the artwork were nothing more than the artist's private confession. Hegel resists this reduction. True art carries ethical substance. It reflects the spirit of a people, the structure of its world, the depth of its conflicts. It gives form to collective consciousness. Yet art is limited because sensuous form cannot fully contain the infinite. The material medium resists. Stone remains stone. Sound fades. Image depends on perspective. Art reveals truth, but it cannot articulate it completely. It gestures beyond itself. Second, religion elevates truth into representation. Where art shows, religion narrates. It speaks in symbols, myths, sacred stories. The unity of divine and human, the reconciliation of finite and infinite, appears in the figure of God, in ritual, in worship. Religion addresses the whole person, not merely intellect. In religion, spirit contemplates itself as absolute. But this contemplation remains in the mode of representation. The divine is imagined as other. The believer kneels before transcendent being. The unity of subject and object is affirmed, yet still externalized in symbolic form. Berlin is powerful because it binds community through shared meaning. It integrates emotion, imagination, ethical commitment. It interprets suffering and hope within comprehensive narrative. For centuries, religion shaped civilizations, oriented laws, justified authority. In the world approaching 2025, religious forms persist, yet often fragmented. Some cling to dogma rigidly. Others dismiss faith as outdated superstition. Both extremes miss Hegel's insight. Religion is moment in spirit's self-knowledge. It is neither final truth nor mere illusion. It is symbolic articulation of what philosophy will later conceptualize. Third, philosophy brings truth to conceptual clarity. What art intuited and religion represented, philosophy comprehends. The unity of finite and infinite, subject and object, freedom and necessity, is no longer veiled in image or myth. It is grasped in thought. Philosophy does not abolish art and religion. It preserves them at higher level. It understands their content and renders it transparent. The absolute, which in religion appeared as God confronting humanity, now appears as spirit knowing itself through rational structure. This is not cold abstraction. It is culmination of long journey, from pure being and nothing, through nature and history, through struggle and institution. Spirit arrives at self-conscious comprehension. Philosophy is the place where the whole becomes intelligible as whole. The danger is arrogance. To imagine that philosophy, having articulated system, stands outside history. Hegel would reject this. Philosophy is itself historical. It arises at particular moment. It reflects maturity of spirit. When he declares that philosophy comprehends its time in thought, he does not claim eternal finality. He claims transparency at a given stage. Art, religion, philosophy form triad of absolute spirit. In art, truth is seen. In religion, truth is believed. In philosophy, truth is known. These are not mutually exclusive domains. They interpenetrate. A culture rich in art without reflective depth risks superficiality. A culture of religion without conceptual clarity risks dogmatism. A philosophy detached from living symbols risks sterility. Psychologically, these forms correspond to dimensions of human existence. We need beauty, we need meaning, we need understanding. To amputate any dimension impoverishes spirit. The individual who lives only in abstract reasoning becomes desiccated. The one who lives only in aesthetic sensation lacks structure. The one who clings only to inherited symbols may resist growth. Absolute spirit does not abolish finitude, it integrates it. In art, the finite form carries infinite content. In religion, temporal narrative bears eternal significance. In philosophy, the historical system reveals rational necessity. The absolute is not escape from world. It is comprehension of world as self-articulation of spirit. Consider a tragedy performed on stage. The hero confronts fate. Conflict unfolds. Suffering culminates in insight. The audience experiences catharsis. This is not mere entertainment. It is spirit confronting its own contradictions and finding reconciliation in understanding. The aesthetic experience prefigures philosophical comprehension. Consider religious ritual. The community gathers. Words are spoken, symbols enacted. Participants feel connected to transcendent order. This shared experience binds individuals into ethical unity. Even if concepts remain implicit, the structure of reconciliation is present. Philosophy steps in and asks, what is this reconciliation? How does finite reconcile with infinite? How does freedom coexist with necessity? It answers not with image or story, but with concept. It demonstrates that the absolute is process of self-mediation. That truth lies in totality. That contradiction is engine of development. In the era approaching 2025, art proliferates digitally. Images circulate endlessly. Music streams without pause. Yet the depth of aesthetic experience often diminishes. Religion polarizes into fervor or indifference. Philosophy fragments into specialized disciplines. The unity of absolute spirit seems dispersed. The challenge is integration. To recover art as revelation of truth, not commodity. To engage religion as symbolic depth, not ideological weapon. To practice philosophy as rigorous comprehension, not academic isolation. Spirit demands wholeness. Absolute spirit is not mystical finale. It is the point at which spirit recognizes that all previous stages were its own moments. Logic was its skeleton. Nature was its external body. Ethical life was its social structure. History was its temporal unfolding. Art, religion, philosophy are its self-reflection. Yet even here, movement does not cease, because to comprehend is to stand at threshold of new questioning. If philosophy articulates the whole, it must also examine its own limits. If absolute spirit knows itself, it must confront whether this knowledge can remain living or risk ossification. The journey that began with pure being does not terminate in static system. It circles back into living experience. Each generation must appropriate the system anew. Each individual must traverse stages of consciousness personally. The absolute is not museum artifact. It is ongoing act of self-recognition. And so, spirit, having traced its path from immediacy to self-clarity, now faces a more intimate demand. Not merely to understand the system, but to live it. Not merely to contemplate freedom, but to enact it. Because the ultimate test of self-knowing spirit is whether it can sustain its unity within the concrete struggles of existence, where beauty, faith, and thought must converge in the daily task of becoming fully human. Reality is not fragmented, and neither are we. This is the courage that Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel demands of us. He does not offer comfort, he offers structure. He does not flatter the individual with fantasies of isolated genius. He situates the individual within a living totality. From pure being to absolute spirit, from sensation to philosophy. The journey reveals one relentless truth. Contradiction is not the enemy of meaning. It is its condition. We began with dialectic and discovered that truth moves. We passed through consciousness and learned that immediacy deceives. We stood in the struggle for recognition and saw that freedom requires the other. We entered the absolute and realized that subject and object are not enemies, but moments of one unfolding whole. We descended into logic and found that being itself trembles into becoming. We watched the idea estrange itself as nature, limited and mortal. We witnessed spirit rise beyond instinct, institutionalize freedom, and shape the state as rational order. We traced history as the battlefield where freedom gradually becomes aware of itself. And finally, we saw spirit reflect upon its own depth in art, religion, and philosophy. Nothing stands alone, not the individual, not the state, not even thought. Everything participates in movement. Everything bears tension within it. And every tension, when endured rather than denied, becomes the engine of development. Hegel's vision is severe. Freedom is not given. It is constructed. It is mediated. It is earned through struggle, labor, recognition, and institutional embodiment. History is not meaningless suffering. It is spirit learning through conflict. Philosophy is not dry abstraction. It is the moment when spirit sees its own path clearly. The implication is unavoidable. To live philosophically is not to escape the world, but to confront it as a rational process. Your conflicts are not accidental. Your doubts are not signs of failure. Your need for recognition is not weakness. There are moments in the unfolding of self-conscious freedom. Truth is not an opinion to defend. It is a whole to comprehend. Freedom is not impulse to indulge. It is participation in rational universality. And meaning is not found in isolated fragments of experience, but in the courage to see oneself as part of a living, self-developing totality. When philosophy reaches this depth, it ceases to be theory. It becomes awakening. It becomes the point at which humanity recognizes that reality is not alien, that history is not absurd, and that the struggle within and around us is the very process through which spirit becomes fully aware of itself. And in that recognition, there is no return to innocence. There is only the task of thinking, acting, and living as if the whole were real.